Inside Rikers, the hidden power of gangs running the prison. The bloodied throne of Rikers. The lights in Rikers flickered that night. Guards rushed toward the cell block, but it was already too late. A young inmate lay on the ground, blood dripping from his face, while a group of men stood over him, calm, almost in control. But here's the shocking part: these weren't guards. They weren't even prison officials. These were gang members. And they weren't just attacking another inmate. They were sending a message. A message that said, "We run this place." Not the officers. Not the warden. Us. In that moment, Rikers Island wasn't a jail anymore. It was their kingdom. Guards froze. Some even looked the other way. Because inside those walls, gangs weren't just surviving, they were ruling. But how did it come to this? How did one of America's most infamous jails become a place where gangs hold more power than the very people running it? And just how far does that hidden power really go? The beginning of control. Rikers Island, New York City. A jail so big it's almost a city of its own. More than 10,000 people locked inside at its peak. And within that population, gangs were everywhere. The Bloods, the Crips, the Trinitarios, the Latin Kings. Each one carving out their own corner of the island. At first, it started small. A few favors here, a few threats there. Cigarettes, food, and even protection sold like black market treasure. New inmates quickly learned a rule: if you didn't belong to a crew, you were alone. And in Rikers, being alone meant being prey. Less extreme days inside felt deceptively calm. Inmates played cards, talked through bars, and shared meals. The officers walked their rounds, pretending they had things under control. But everyone knew that control was only surface deep. Because every calm day was just a pause before the storm. And when the storm came, it hit like fire. One night, in a crowded dorm, a fight broke out. At first, it seemed like a regular brawl. Two inmates shoving, fists flying. Guards tried to break it up. But then, boom, the room exploded. Dozens of inmates jumped in, fists, makeshift shanks, chaos everywhere. But here's the twist: this wasn't random. This was ordered. A test from one gang against another, to prove dominance. And in the end, the guards weren't the winners. The gang that orchestrated it walked away stronger, their grip over Rikers tightening like a fist. The tax of survival. Every inmate knew the deal. You wanted a bed where you could sleep without fear? You had to pay. Sometimes it was food from the chow hall. Sometimes it was money sent from family on the outside. Sometimes it was work, favors carried out for the gang in charge. Even the smallest things, like a toothbrush or an extra blanket, could come with a price tag. This was called the tax. And if you didn't pay, you suffered. For a moment, life inside could feel almost like routine. Inmates lined up for meals, sat in the yard, and cracked jokes about the guards. But behind that laughter, everyone knew there was no freedom. The gang's hidden hands were always pulling the strings. The next extreme moment came during a Sunday night lockdown. A correction officer opened a cell door for routine checks. Suddenly, a shadow moved. In seconds, the officer was surrounded, not by one inmate, but by 5. He was stripped, beaten, and humiliated. Not because the gang wanted to escape. Not because they wanted revenge. But because they wanted to prove a point. We own this block. And the terrifying part? Other officers didn't rush to help. They backed off. Because even they feared the gang's power. The silent deals. Not every show of power in Rikers was loud. Some of it happened in whispers. Late at night, when most inmates tried to sleep, gang leaders held quiet meetings in the shadows of the day room. They didn't need phones or fancy plans. Their messages traveled by word of mouth, inmate to inmate, cell to cell. Within hours, an order could spread across the whole jail like wildfire. This hidden network reached beyond the walls. Contraband, cell phones, drugs, even weapons, moved in and out of Rikers as if the gates didn't exist. Some of it smuggled in by visitors. Some of it slipped in by corrupt staff. Everyone had a price, and the gangs knew how to pay it. For a while, it seemed calm. The gangs didn't need open fights every day. Their control was already established. Officers kept their heads down. Inmates played along, pretending life was normal. But then came the extreme. One morning, a rival gang tried to challenge the system. They refused to pay the tax. They thought numbers alone could protect them. They were wrong. Before breakfast was even served, the block erupted. Bunks flipped, fists swung, and shanks flashed. It wasn't a fight, it was a punishment. By the time the guards finally regained control, several inmates were bleeding on the floor, and the message was carved into everyone's mind: no one breaks the rules. Not here. And just when it looked like things couldn't get worse, the gangs took their influence even higher. When guards look away, control inside Rikers didn't just belong to the gangs, it leaked into the officers too. Some correction officers admitted privately that they avoided certain blocks because they knew who really ran them. Others cut deals. If they allowed gangs to control the smaller problems, like keeping inmates in line, the officers could keep their jobs easier. Less fights, less paperwork. At least on the surface. So, for a short while, things looked calm again. Officers walked past cells, ignoring low-level fights. Inmates followed the gang's rules, not the jails. And to outsiders it looked like order. But order inside Rikers was an illusion. And illusions always break. One night during lockdown, a guard turned a corner and froze. He wasn't looking at a fight. He wasn't looking at a shakedown. He was staring at something worse. A gang leader, standing bold in the middle of the tier, holding the guard's own keys. The man smiled. Not a word was spoken. He didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. The power wasn't in the warden's office. It wasn't in the guard's hands. It was in his. And with that, the balance of control inside Rikers shifted once again. The Courtroom Connection. Rikers wasn't just a jail. It was a marketplace of influence. And gangs knew their power stretched far beyond the fences. Court dates were supposed to be moments of hope for inmates. A chance to see daylight, maybe shave time off their sentence. But for many, court was just another arena controlled by the gangs. Sometimes, an inmate would arrive at the courthouse in Queens or Manhattan and find himself surrounded by the same faces from the inside, gang members watching him closely. The message was silent but sharp: don't snitch, don't speak out, or your people on the inside will pay. For weeks, the jail would seem calm. Inmates lined up for chow, made phone calls, even played basketball in the yard. It looked almost normal. But underneath, deals were being struck. Lawyers were pressured. Witnesses silenced. Some even vanished before trial. And then came the breaking point. One young inmate, desperate to cut a deal with prosecutors, agreed to testify against a gang leader. He thought he'd be safe in protective custody. He thought the walls of Rikers would shield him. But when officers opened his cell one morning, he was gone. Not dead, just missing. His bed empty, his body nowhere. To this day, whispers inside Rikers say the gangs arranged for him to be moved, hidden, and silenced forever. The message was clear. The gang's hand reached farther than anyone imagined. The officer's choice. By now, the correction officers faced a dangerous reality. They could fight the gangs, or work with them. Some chose loyalty to the job. They searched cells, confiscated weapons, and tried to restore control. But many learned the hard way. When you go against the gangs, you become a target. Days would pass quietly. Guards did their rounds, inmates played dominoes, and everything looked calm. Then, without warning, the calm would break. One evening, during dinner call, an officer was ambushed. Inmates surrounded him, grabbed his radio, and beat him so badly that he barely survived. Because earlier that week, he had confiscated a smuggled phone from a gang leader's cell. After that, more officers made their choice. Look the other way. Some even became allies, sneaking in drugs, tobacco, or phones. In return, they got protection and money. But the extreme moment that shattered any illusion of safety came during a routine shakedown. Guards stormed a block, expecting to find hidden contraband. Instead, they stumbled onto something worse: ledgers. Books filled with names, payments, and orders. Proof that the gangs weren't just running the jail. They were running business. Extortion, drug sales, even hits carried out beyond the walls of Rikers, all organized from inside. The discovery should have brought down the empire. But instead, it exposed something darker. The gangs weren't hiding anymore. They were operating in plain sight. And the guards who found those ledgers? They had a choice: report it, or risk their lives. The riot nobody stopped. It started with whispers. A rumor spreading across Rikers. One gang leader had been disrespected by another. To outsiders it might sound small, just words. But in Rikers, disrespect is blood fuel. For days, the jail felt strangely quiet. Inmates kept to themselves. Officers noticed the silence but didn't dare ask questions. Everyone could feel something brewing. Then came the spark. In the middle of chow hall, one inmate flipped a tray onto another's lap. That was the signal. Within seconds, the room exploded. Trays became weapons. Forks turned into blades. Chairs smashed against skulls. Dozens of men leapt into battle, not fighting for food or survival, but for power. The officers tried to intervene. Radios screamed, boots pounded across the floor. But here's the truth: they were outnumbered. They stood back, shouting orders no one listened to, while the gangs tore each other apart. The riot raged for nearly half an hour before tactical units stormed in. By then, the floor was slick with blood. Stretcher after stretcher rolled out. And the message was clear: in Rikers, a single word could start a war. But the most chilling part? Later, investigators learned the riot wasn't random at all. It had been staged, planned weeks in advance by one gang to wipe out their rivals in a single, bloody afternoon. And it worked. The shadow government. After the riot, things calmed down. The halls of Rikers fell into a tense silence. Inmates spoke softer. Guards walked faster. For a moment, it looked like the chaos had burned itself out. But that was the illusion. In reality, the gangs had just tightened their grip. Inside certain blocks, there were rules not written by the Department of Correction, but by the gang leaders. Bed assignments, meal distribution, even who got phone time, all controlled by them. Some inmates actually felt safer under this shadow system. At least they keep order, one whispered. Others knew the truth: that order came at a cost. Weeks passed quietly. But then came the breaking point. A young inmate, new to Rikers, refused to follow the gang's rules. He thought the guards would protect him. He thought the jail's rules were enough. One night, the lights flickered out. In the darkness, voices moved. When the power returned, the boy was gone. His body was later found in the showers, beaten so badly he was unrecognizable. The gangs didn't hide what they'd done. They wanted everyone to know. The hidden power wasn't hidden anymore. It was the law of Rikers. And now, even the officers began whispering the same thing the inmates already knew: the gangs were the government inside those walls. Families held hostage. Power inside Rikers didn't stop at the razor wire. It reached into the neighborhoods of New York, into the homes of families who had loved ones locked up. For some inmates, protection inside Rikers came at a price their families had to pay. Phone calls weren't just for saying hello. They were orders. Mothers, girlfriends, even younger brothers were told: send money, drop off packages, or face the consequences. At first, it was small things. Commissary money. Cigarettes. Sneakers. But soon, the demands grew darker. Families on the outside were pressured to smuggle drugs, deliver cell phones, even hold weapons for gang members waiting to come home. For a while, it seemed manageable. Families complied quietly, too scared to say no. Inmates inside avoided immediate harm. But then came the breaking point. One woman, desperate and tired of being used, refused to bring in contraband for her boyfriend's gang. She thought distance would protect her. She thought the walls of Rikers separated her from the danger. She was wrong. That night her brother, just 16 years old, was jumped in the Bronx by masked men. He survived, but barely. The message was brutal and clear: the gang's reach was limitless. Refuse them and your family pays. Inside Rikers, the whispers grew louder. Gangs weren't just running the jail. They were running lives outside of it. The illusion of safety. After incidents like that, the Department of Correction tried to tighten security. More searches, more lockdowns, more restrictions on visits. On the surface, it looked like they were regaining control. For a few days, things seemed calm. Inmates lined up quietly, guards walked the tiers with authority, and order returned, at least to the eyes of the public. But everyone inside knew better. Because safety in Rikers was always an illusion. Gangs didn't need chaos to prove their power, they needed fear. And then came the extreme event that shattered the illusion once again. During a routine headcount, an officer opened a cell and froze. Inside, taped to the wall, was a note written in bold letters. "We run Rikers. You just work here." Beside it, a crude map of the jail, marking guard routes and blind spots. Proof that the gangs weren't just controlling blocks, they were studying the system itself. That discovery sent shockwaves through the staff. If inmates had this much intelligence, this much planning, how much longer before they used it for something bigger? And that question haunted everyone inside. Blueprints of escape. By now, gangs weren't just controlling the blocks. They were testing the limits of Rikers itself. Inside certain cells, scraps of paper and whispers carried a dangerous secret: escape plans. Not the kind of clumsy breakouts you see in movies, but carefully mapped strategies, timed with guard rotations, marked with weak spots in fences, even calculated down to the second when the lights flickered. It all started small. Inmates studied the patterns: when officers took smoke breaks, when gates opened for food deliveries, how long it took for alarms to be answered. Every detail was written down. For weeks, it seemed like nothing more than talk. Inmates went about their days. They played basketball, argued over TV channels, and ate their meals. The calm returned. But then, during a surprise shakedown, officers uncovered a chilling find: a stash hidden behind a bunk. Inside, they found ropes made of bedsheets, crude lockpicking tools, and sketches of the jail's layout. This wasn't fantasy, it was real. A gang wasn't just running Rikers from the inside. They were planning to break free, to embarrass the system, and to prove ultimate control. The discovery sent officers into panic. But here's the chilling part. For every plan they found, there were whispers of others they didn't. And then came the extreme. Weeks later, during a routine kitchen shift, an inmate slipped out of sight. Moments later, alarms blared. He had managed to squeeze into a service tunnel, moving fast toward the edge of the facility. Guards scrambled, but by the time they caught him, the message was already out. If one man can try, an army could succeed. The war inside the walls. The failed escape attempt didn't bring calm, it brought chaos. Rival gangs saw it as weakness, and weakness inside Rikers is an open wound. At first, the jail fell into uneasy silence. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Then, without warning, the cell blocks erupted. Two gangs clashed in what would become one of the bloodiest nights in Rikers history. Weapons weren't smuggled in that night, they were already there. Shanks made from toothbrushes, pipes ripped from walls, even broken glass from shattered windows. Inmates poured out of their cells during recreation, turning the block into a battlefield. Officers rushed in, but many were forced back by the sheer numbers. Radios crackled with desperate calls for backup. Some guards barricaded themselves in control booths, powerless to stop the storm outside. By the time tactical units regained control, the damage was irreversible. Dozens of inmates were injured. Several nearly lost their lives. And the gangs? They emerged stronger. Because in Rikers, every riot, every clash, every drop of blood only deepened their power. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't just a jail anymore. It was a war zone, and the gangs were the generals. The invisible hand. After the riot, the world outside thought order had returned. News headlines reported lockdowns and increased security. Politicians promised change. But inside Rikers, the gangs were only getting stronger. Their power wasn't just in fists anymore, it was in influence. Some officers began to rely on gangs to keep order in their blocks. As long as the leaders kept inmates calm, the guards turned a blind eye. It was a dangerous deal, but for many, it was survival. For a while, this uneasy partnership created a strange calm. Blocks stayed quiet, fights slowed down, and daily life looked almost normal. To the outside world, it seemed like Rikers was finally under control. But that calm was a mask. Because behind the scenes, Gangs were calling shots that reached far beyond who got the top bunk. They decided who got protection, who got beaten, and even who lived to see court. The breaking point came when a correction captain tried to crack down on a gang-run block. He ordered searches, confiscated contraband, and wrote up inmates by the dozen. Days later, his car was found vandalized outside his home in Queens. His tires slashed, windshield shattered. And on the hood, a single word scratched into the paint: stop. The message was clear: the gang's power didn't stop at Rikers' gates. They could reach anyone, anywhere. The puppeteers of power. By now, the gangs weren't just running the blocks. They were influencing the very structure of the jail. Union officials quietly admitted that officers refused to work certain tiers controlled by gangs. Some shifts were traded, some posts abandoned, just to avoid confrontation. Leadership at the top faced a choice: admit that gangs had power, or pretend everything was fine. For weeks, things seemed calmer again. Politicians toured the facility, cameras flashing, as officials promised reform. But the inmates laughed quietly to themselves. They knew the truth: nothing had changed. Then came the extreme. During a high-level meeting, one officer leaked shocking information to investigators. Gang leaders were dictating transfers. Inmates who didn't pay taxes, who refused orders, were being moved, sometimes with the help of corrupt staff, to blocks where they could be handled. The gangs weren't just surviving inside Rikers. They were shaping it, pulling strings like puppeteers, deciding fates, one inmate at a time. And the most chilling part? No one knew exactly how deep the corruption went, or how many officers were already under their thumb. Collapse from within. By now, Rikers Island was no longer just a jail. It was a kingdom with gangs sitting on the throne. On paper, the Department of Correction was in charge. In reality, officers were outnumbered, leadership was outplayed, and the gang's rules governed daily life. For a while, there was quiet. No riots, no escapes, no headlines. To the outside world, it looked like stability had returned. But inside, the silence was heavy. Everyone knew it was the silence before a storm. The storm broke when a group of officers refused to enter a housing unit rumored to be gang-controlled. They claimed it was unsafe, too many weapons, too many threats. For hours, that block went unguarded. No rounds, no searches. And in that gap, the gangs showed their strength. They held their own court. Inmates were dragged from bunks, lined up, and punished for debts unpaid. Shouts echoed down the halls while the rest of the jail watched helplessly. When officers finally moved back in, it was over. Blood on the floor, broken bodies, and silence again. But the message was brutal. If officers wouldn't control the jail, the gangs would. That night, one officer whispered to another, "Rikers has already collapsed. We just haven't admitted it yet." The new warden. In the aftermath, leadership scrambled to reassert control. More lockdowns. More transfers. More promises. But it was too late. The gangs didn't fear the warden. They didn't fear the system. Because, inside, the gangs had their own warden. A leader so powerful that even rival gangs listened to him. His orders carried more weight than the actual administration. For weeks, his word kept the peace. No riots, no chaos, just quiet obedience. Inmates lined up when told. Guards reported fewer fights. On the surface, it looked like Rikers was healing. But peace inside Rikers came at a terrifying cost. It belonged to the gangs, not the law. Then one night the illusion cracked wide open. During count, an officer noticed something strange. The block was too quiet. He walked further in and froze. Dozens of inmates were standing at attention, lined up military style. And at the front of the room, the gang leader stood, staring straight at the officer. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He just smiled, and every inmate behind him stayed perfectly still. In that moment, the officer realized the truth. The gangs didn't just run Rikers. They owned it. The leaks. For years, the hidden power of gangs at Rikers was just whispers, rumors swapped in the yard, half-truths buried in reports. But then cracks appeared. A correction officer, fed up with watching gangs dictate every move, secretly recorded conversations on his shift. In those tapes, Inmates openly boasted about controlling the jail. They spoke about ordering hits, taxing inmates, and smuggling contraband with the help of staff. When the tapes leaked, they sent shockwaves through the city. Newspapers ran headlines, "Who really runs Rikers?" Politicians demanded answers. But the truth was already out. The world now knew what insiders had whispered for years. Gangs weren't just a presence inside Rikers, they were the real power. The unseen king. Investigations followed. Task forces stormed blocks. Contraband was seized. Inmates were transferred. For a while, it seemed like the system was finally fighting back. But the gangs had already prepared. Leaders simply shifted power, passing control to lieutenants, moving influence through secret channels. Cutting off one head only seemed to grow two more. And somewhere deep inside those walls, the gang warden kept giving orders. Quiet, calm, untouchable. To some inmates, he was a savior, keeping order where the system failed. To others, he was a tyrant, ruling through fear, violence, and control. Either way, the reality was chilling. One man held more influence inside Rikers than the people sworn to run it. The empire of silence. So what does this all mean? It means that behind the headlines, behind the razor wire, Rikers Island became more than just a jail. It became an empire where gangs ruled through fear, influence, and silence. An empire so powerful that guards looked away, families outside were controlled, and even the system itself bent under their grip. Rikers was supposed to be a place of justice. Instead, it turned into a place where hidden kings wore no crown, but their word was law. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. Because when gangs run a jail, the lines blur. Who's really in charge? The officers with badges? Or the men in cells with nothing but whispers, weapons, and willpower? One thing is certain. Rikers Island stands as proof of a haunting truth. Sometimes, the walls built to hold people in can't hold back power. And inside those walls, the gangs still reign.